Chapter 16, Growing a Global Heart, Healing Our Societal Wounds, Encounter with Belvie Rooks and Dedan Gills. Opening quote from Belvie and Dedan. To plant a tree is to plant hope. Belvie Rooks and Dedan Gills are the co-founders of Growing a Global Heart. This is a vision that inspires the ceremonial planting of millions of memorial trees to honor the forgotten souls of our past. These are the victims of urban violence, the Underground Railroad, and the transatlantic slave route in West Africa. They do this as part of a process for collective healing and a solution to climate change. The Growing a Global Heart motto is this: healing the wounds of the past in the present while creating a sustainable future. Their tree planting ceremonies seed new hope for humanity and for the earth. Here's their story. From a broken heart to an open heart. The door of no return is in Ghana, West Africa. It's at the Elmina Slave Dungeon. Belvie Rooks and Dedan Gills were standing in this doorway in 2007. They were never quite the same after standing in the door of no return. The Elmina Slave Dungeon was the origin site of their African ancestors' enslavement. For over 3 centuries, African men, women, and children were kidnapped from their villages, from their families, and thrown into slave dungeons along Africa's west coast. If they survived the horror of the dungeons, they were pushed through the door of no return onto the infamous slave ships for transport across the Atlantic Ocean. And if they survived that voyage, they arrived in what was called the New World. They were branded and sold into slavery. As Belvie and Dedan stood there, at the door of no return in Ghana, their pain was overwhelming. Tears overflowed. It was during that experience, in the depths of their despair, that their global heart vision was born. Like the water that breaks to signal the birth of a child, their tears ushered in a new creation. When I first met Belvie Rooks and Dedan Gills, I felt the presence of something that had been born in them. I came to know it as the power of love. Their brokenheartedness had been transformed into open-heartedness. It was extraordinary. I met them at a small roadside cafe in the middle of nowhere. It was synchronicity, we said. As I sat there in the restaurant, hearing their story, I felt that they had found a way out of the most lethal prison of our time. It's not a prison with iron bars, but it's an inner prison. It's the mindset of us versus them, me against you. I felt that Belvie and Dedan were breaking free from that whole mindset. Even those who had been enemies to African Americans, we think, for example, of Confederate soldiers in U.S. history, even these came to be included in the sphere of their open-hearted concern. Belvie and Dedan recognized that trees breathe for the whole, and soil contains the blood, bone, sweat, and tears of everyone, on whatever side. In their vision, I saw a similarity to Nelson Mandela's journey to transcend societal divides and to emerge a new vision of truth and reconciliation. At the time that I met Belvie and Dedan, I had been fighting against the forces I viewed as my enemy. Protest against an outer enemy seemed to me the only viable path to any social change. So, maybe looking back, it was humorous. I carried a sign that said peace. But truthfully, I saw the world as a battle between us versus them. Belvie and Dedan, however, saw the world quite differently from that. The whole human race, they said, is our family, and the small blue planet is our common home. As African Americans, they suffered from the history of racial hatred and the discrimination endemic to our culture. They grew up hearing, back of the bus, whites only, stay in your place. They had been longtime civil rights activists. In 2007, something special happened. They traveled to Ghana to get married. They were in midlife. And when they were there, a new path of activism opened up for them. It was heart-based. It happened at Elmina Slave Dungeon, where they wept for the African children, men and women, many of their ancient ancestors who had been pushed through that door of no return. The ancestors' names were erased from history. Belvie and Dedan, they could find out the names of the ships. They could find out the names of the capitalistic investors of the ships. But what about the names of those who had actually entered through the door of no return? They were erased. Belvie told me, erasure. That's a deep, deep wound. Standing in the dungeon, a place of incomprehensible violence and suffering, of course they wept. They felt rage. Despair loomed large. What could ever heal this horrific historic wound done by and to humanity? The natural human emotions of rage and despair were alchemized into the power of love by a single question. It was a question that Dedan posed to Belvie at that critical point. He asked, what would healing look like? This question had a profound impact, and it had a carrier wave of creativity, unity, and hope. As they attempted to live out the impact of the question, Belvie and Dedan found it impossible to see the world solely in terms of us versus them. What would it mean to live from a place of embracing the whole human race as one's family? And what would it look like if this small, beautiful blue planet were known to be our common home? Once, Belvie told me, she was sitting in a quiet meditation, and there was another question that emerged. It was one that she didn't really want to face. The question was, well, what about the Confederate soldier? That's the ultimate enemy. In the moment, she wasn't prepared for that question and actively resisted it. In a quest to unravel the mystery of it, she traveled alone to visit a Confederate cemetery where she had a profound epiphany and laid her flower at the foot of a grave of a young soldier who had died at age 17. And she told me, I realized it's the innocence of the child within all of us who grow up to believe things that we were taught. Belvie explained their quest and their unique approach to a group of college students. She was speaking of her work in social justice and civil rights. And she told them, yes, it's important to focus on the problem, but it's equally important to focus on a solution. Belvie had a dream where she was embracing children of all different races from all around the world. In the dream, waves of energy emanated from her heart. and she felt a deep, deep love for the children of every nation. As she woke up from that dream, she wondered to herself, what would the world be like if our love for all the children inspired our love for all people? Love is the key healer, she said. Love is calling through our youth. They long to be protected and nurtured. As I heard Belvie speak of this dream, it reminded me of what the Buddhist nun, Jetsunna Tenzin Palmo, said to me. To love all children as if they are one's own, that is something. Belvie's dream showed the power of the heart to heal all of humanity. Love unifies, it embraces, while anger divides. In the same kind of way, Dedan told me about his belief that hearts long to beat in tandem with each other. Here's what he said.
I read somewhere that if you take the heart cells of two different human beings, beating at different rates, and you put them in the same petri dish, one of them will pause so that they can beat in synchronicity with one another. I think that's what we want to do. I think that's what we yearn for, to be in synchronicity with other hearts. And that's what growing a global heart is about, to take pause from how you look at the world and try to beat in tandem with the other hearts around you.
Belvie and Dedan taught me to take pause of my beliefs, to listen to others. As an activist, I had been opinionated and oppositional. This kind of attitude was noted by His Holiness the 17th Karmapa during his United States tour in 2015. I felt like he was talking about me. He said, activists can often be unwarrantedly aggressive. He emphasized the need for people to approach activism with compassion, not arrogance or pride, or some mentality that they are somehow better than others. Well, that had been me. Belvie and Dedan taught me a different way. The people I interviewed for this book, they taught me that when we apply the principles of love to societal problems, it works best to simply stand for truth, like the truth that all are created equal. We don't have to fight against something or someone. Blaming gets us nowhere. Force leads to counterforce. So, for example, someone who worked with Mother Teresa told me that Mother Teresa might stand at a peace vigil, but never at an anti-war protest. And this is the kind of approach I saw in Belvie and Dedan. They stand for the oneness of being. It's a oneness of being that includes also the natural world, which is celebrated in one of Dedan's poems, The Tree and Me.
The tree and me. Morning glow, prelude to flight. Moving shadows, dazzling light. Insect array, melodic sound. Wandering roots, fertile ground. Dying leaf, tender bud. Sun-parched earth, winter mud. Sanctuary joy, leafy glade. April shower, summer shade. Carbon loving, oxygen giving. The tree and me, reciprocal living. Hushed in silence, her canopies in trance. Together we live. Together we dance.
When I met with Belvie and Dedan, I asked them, why do you plant trees? They told me the tree is an inclusive manifestation of unconditional love. When a tree reaches its maturity, it bears fruit. It provides shade and sanctuary. It can even be used to make houses. And when you think about it, on a hot day, when you're trying to walk across town, you can get nice and cool and comfortable under a tree. Dedan told me, quote, "The tree unconditionally gives to everyone who comes into its presence. It never says to one person, 'You can't have any of my fruit,' or to another, 'Oh, well, you can have some.' No, the tree bears the fruit, and it's there for the picking, for the birds, the rodents, squirrels, whatever, and whoever comes." Dedan explained the unifying symbolism of the tree for our societal problems. He said this:
We live at a time in which none of the standard ways of resolving human conflict are working for us. Somehow we have to come up with transcendent models that are beyond Democrat versus Republican or nation state versus nation state, male versus female, old versus young. All of those divides and identities that put walls around us, and they point at other people as being the cause of our misery. The tree transcends those divides. It challenges us to emulate it in its magnificence and its beauty, in its stillness, in its nobility. To plant a tree is an act of love, because depending on the type of tree, it may take years for it to bear fruit. An olive tree takes 25 to 30 years to produce an olive. This means that you're not planting it for yourself. You're planting it for the future.
Growing a Global Heart, the story. Belvie and Dedan came to the University of Redlands, where I work, 2 different times, in 2011 and 2014. They shared their story of transformation with diverse groups of people, college students, and community members from all walks of life. Through photographs, poetry, and personal experiences, they told the story of where, when, and how Growing a Global Heart was born. The audiences were riveted. Here is what Belvie and Dedan said.
Experience in Africa. In 2007, we were in Ghana, West Africa, to get married. We're actually celebrating our 7th wedding anniversary this month.
When people like you come to hear our message, the honor is ours. We feel like what we have to say is important in the world. We know the vision we came up with in Africa is not a solution to all the world's problems, and we're not telling anyone else what to do. In the complexity of life, every segment and every aspect of the living dynamic is necessary, and it moves us forward. People approach social change 1,000 different ways.
With this photo, I've invited into this room my great-great-grandmother, Grandma Martha, who was 12 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation occurred. This means she lived for 12 years as an enslaved child. I like to invite her into spaces like this because these are the spaces she never would have been allowed to enter. We want to use her also as a way of inviting all of our ancestors into the room. Your ancestors, all of our ancestors. In 1957, Ghana was the first African country to gain its independence from British colonial rule. I had met Brother Ishmael Tete in Los Angeles at the Agape Spiritual Center. Brother Tete is a West African shamanic teacher and wisdom holder from the Akan spiritual tradition. He said, "If you come to Ghana, I'll perform your wedding ceremony."
This was a transformative moment for me because of my background. When I was going to UCLA, I was a college student in the daytime and in the Black Panther Party underground at night. When I stood in that church that day in Ghana, and they introduced us to that congregation, everybody reached out their hands and they started saying, some in different languages, some in English, "Welcome home. Welcome home. This is your home." I was touched so deeply by that experience. I don't think I've ever been the same since.
While we were preparing for our wedding ceremony in Accra, in northern Ghana, they had a major flood that displaced 400,000 people. We were there just at the time they were having this major disaster. Catastrophic climate change in Africa takes two forms. Sometimes it's flooding, and at other times it's drought. Bishop Desmond Tutu lists 28 countries in the world as most vulnerable to climate change, and 22 of them are in Africa, even though Africa has a very small carbon footprint. It was hard for us to ignore that we were there at a critical time, seeing things that made us conscious of the larger environmental context. Immediately following our commitment ceremony in Accra, we left for the Cape Coast of Ghana to visit the Elmina Slave Dungeon. We wanted to begin our union by paying homage to the countless ancestors who had begun the long journey into slavery from one of the more than 100 slave dungeons along Africa's west coast.
Right in the center of the dungeon, also called a castle, is the Dutch Reformed Church. Above the door is a reference to Psalms 132:13. The Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his habitation. Now, I couldn't make sense of that. It felt so ironic. It's important to look back and know the history and the lineage of a problem. In academia, they call that the formative context. When you go to a doctor or you go to the hospital, they ask you, did your mother have this? Did your father have that? Is there a history of this in your family? They want to know the formative context of your medical condition. When a dog has been brutalized, he might be vicious if you try to touch him, and that's why a person who works with dogs wants to know the formative context. They don't judge the dog on its current manifestations. They want to know how she got like that. So we need to understand the formative context of how we arrived at the current racial situation in America and in the world. With every other problem, we hear, you have to face it. A psychologist says, go back and look at your life to understand it. It's ironic that when the question of race comes up, most people have a tendency to say instead, get over it. You don't need to look at the past. It has nothing to do with today. Well, they don't say that about a dog. They don't say that about a person who's had a mental breakdown. And they don't say that about someone who's in a hospital. We felt it was important to visit the slave dungeon and look back as a way of understanding the formative context around race as we experienced and understood it from the perspective of our reality in America.
Earlier, Dedan said Elmina was referred to as both a castle and a dungeon. If you were one of the millions of people who passed through the underground dungeons awaiting shipment, it was a slave dungeon. If, on the other hand, you were the governor and his family living on the floors above and dancing the night away in the lap of luxury, it was a castle. The door of no return was the last point of contact with the African continent for the enslaved African people prior to being put onto ships for the long journey across the ocean and into an unknown and uncertain future. It was also the point where many enslaved men and women chose suicide by jumping into the sea rather than depart from Africa's shores.
When we stood at that door, we both had this sensation of actually standing in the past and looking across time into the future. We thought about our children and our grandchildren, and we thought about all the people who had left places like Elmina so many years ago. We felt as if we had stepped into the story, and we stood there and we knew that it was important to share this story and our experience.
I'd like to share with you my journal entry coming out of this experience. As I stood looking out at the vast ocean beyond, I tried hard to imagine what reaching this spot, this door of no return, must have felt like for some long ago unremembered African ancestor as she stood trembling on the precipice of a terrifyingly uncertain future. One of the most horrifying bits of information shared was the fact that at the height of the slave trade, there were so many dead and dying bodies tossed into the sea at this very spot. The frenzied feeding opportunity resulted in the change of the shark migration pattern along this entire bit of coast. My tears flowed uncontrollably. I sobbed as I glanced at the ocean below. It was hard to process the fact that for over 300 years, without interruption, millions of African men, women, and children had begun the long journey into slavery from this very spot. The names of the people passing through the door of no return have all been erased from our historical memory. The names of the mothers, the fathers, the children, the sister, the brothers, the babies, the aunts, the potters, the weavers, farmers, priests, and healers, most of whom were women. The numerous slave dungeons, over 100, along the west coast of Africa, in places like Elmina and the Cape Coast in Ghana, and Gorée Island in Senegal, are living monuments and stark reminders of our inhumane history. All of our histories and all of our collective lineages of suffering. And now, could we just sit and breathe for a minute? For a long time, I couldn't read this without crying. It was hard to write. It's hard to re-experience even now. And it's hard for people like you who are so open-hearted to hear. We sit in silent and heartfelt embrace of all of the millions of people forced to endure it.
Belvie wept while we were in that dungeon. I'm kind of stoic. I held it in like men tend to do. We men don't want to let people see us cry. Try to be strong. Still, there was a certain place in that building that touched me very deeply. There was a dungeon with enfants inscribed over the doorway. I was doing really well until I looked at that little room, and I thought about the infants and the children who had been kidnapped from their families. Oftentimes, the kidnappers, to be perfectly honest with you, were people who looked like me. They were harvesting for the Europeans, who waited on the coastline to purchase those children for guns or liquor, trinkets. And they did this for 300 years. Can you imagine? It broke my heart to think of all those children sleeping on straw mats in that dark, damp, smelly, horrible place.
Afterward, we sat quietly and listened to the crashing waves on the rocks and the howling winds. The wind reminded us of the wails and moans of the people who pass through these dungeons. I believe it's important to go into the depths of darkness. People are excited about what we do now and the current transformation, but my spiritual teachers talk about how important it is to go into the depths of the darkness and the despair. This is where the discomfort is, the pain and the longing and the tears. It's also where the healing occurs. We appreciate your being with us and so present at this stage of the journey when it was very hard. It was particularly hard for me because I'd heard so much about the women and their suffering. I don't see myself as having a lot of courage, but I had to go back into the women's dungeon alone and sit there and be there. I felt called to honor the spirits of the hundreds and thousands of women who had been forced to live the horror. They were forced to endure it. The least I could do was bear witness, as best I could, to their suffering. I must confess that it was one of the hardest things that I have ever done. It's almost as if the energy and spirit of all those women were in that suffocating space. On our guided tour of the dungeon, we had actually walked up the back stairs to the governor's private bedroom. The back stairs that led down to the courtyard of the enslaved women. Periodically, the governor would order that one of the young women, a virgin, be cleaned up and brought up those stairs to his bedroom. I tried hard to imagine what it would have been like to be a part of a community of women preparing a young woman to go up those stairs for the governor's pleasure. Since most of the captured didn't speak the same language, I tried to imagine them singing together. What songs did they sing? I felt like I was there in the circle with them, so I knew there had to be a lot of tears. For me, the tears flowed uncontrollably. We were told that often, after the governor had taken his satisfaction, he turned the young girl over to his elite guards to be raped by them before she was returned to the community of women below. I tried to imagine what it was like the next morning to welcome this ravaged spirit of a child back into the community. I wept uncontrollably as I imagined being there, holding this child, this ravaged and broken young woman. I even tried to imagine what it would be like being the person going up those stairs, but I could not go there. I wanted to imagine accompanying her up the stairs, but I didn't have the courage. Something broke deep within me. I became enraged. I went back to the hotel and couldn't stop crying. We didn't know the names of these women, but I felt like they deserved tears. I cried for 2 days. I thought I was able to talk about this without being tearful. But I'm still not able to, and that's okay. In that moment of debilitating grief, I forgot everything I thought I knew and believed. I was on the board of organizations like the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I professed a belief in oneness. I had spent a lot of time in Quaker circles, but I forgot all the spiritual principles I thought I knew. I had hatred in my heart. I had rage. That's where I was. After 2 days of abject despair, Dedan came and knelt by the bed and gently took my hand and asked me, "What hurts so bad?" It's important to name the pain, but you don't always know what to call it. I ended up telling him that what hurt so bad was the erasure. I knew the names of the ships. I knew the names of the ship's captains. I knew the names of the ship's investors. I knew the amount of cargo that was on each ship. I knew the date when the ships left Bristol, Rhode Island, and when they stopped in Jamaica. I knew everything except who the actual people were. The names of the people. They were just called slaves, not mothers, not fathers, aunties or grandmothers. They were not even seen as human beings. That's what hurt so bad. The wound of erasure.
I'll say again that the formative context is vitally important. Also, we were on our honeymoon. My wife was crying all day, all night. I wanted to know, out of frustration and out of something deep within me, wanting to know if we could ever heal these horrible wounds left upon our souls. It was in the depth of that despair and grief that the question arose. What would healing look like?
The transformative question. That was it. I realized the next morning that Dedan's question was the breakthrough. What would healing look like?
I simply asked her, in the best case scenario, what would healing look like?
It was a profound question. But being in the midst of tears, anger, and the wound, my first reaction was one of annoyance. Healing? I wasn't even in that universe. To be honest, initially, the question was a jarring interruption to the space I was in. What's important about that interruption is that the seed was planted. Dedan's question, what would healing look like, planted a seed. Yes, we have to be with and attend to the wound. We have to be fully there. We have to feel and go through the range of our emotions. But we don't need to stay there. That's not where we need to live. Embracing the heartache and the tears and the sadness, despair, rage. Dedan's question was from the depth of his soul to the depth of mine, as he gently held my hand and asked me to look at him. In order to see him, I had to wipe away the tears. I also felt that all the love he had and that we shared was embodied in that question. What would healing look like? The next morning, I got out of bed because I remembered something the African elders had said to us. When you come out of the slave dungeons, you need to perform a cleansing ritual. You must go to the nearest running water and ceremonially wash your feet because you don't want to walk with all that sorrow. When I remembered that, I went down to the beach for a ritual washing of my feet. While doing that, I kept hearing the phrase, plant a tree. At some point, I recognized it as a line from one of Alice Walker's poems called Torture. When they torture your mother, plant a tree. When they torture your father, plant a tree. The epiphany in the moment was the awareness that a poem that I'd always thought of as being about hopelessness was in fact a poem about hope. The very act of planting a tree, sowing a seed, showed there was a commitment and a vision for the future. It was at that moment, alone, on the beach, washing my feet of sorrow, my beloved Dedan watching protectively above, remembering Alice's poem, that one answer to Dedan's question emerged. In retrospect, with the slave dungeon looming in the distance, it seemed quite mystical. The idea of ceremonially planting trees in memory of all those unknown, unheralded, and forgotten ancestors. So much came together in that moment. Catastrophic climate change, as we had witnessed, was having a devastating impact on the African continent. The persistence of the phrase, plant a tree, felt like an act of honoring and modeling. For trees in their givingness breathe for the whole planet, the collective embodiment of all there is. From the depth of despair, a vision of hope and possibility emerged in response to Dedan's question. Jean Houston's reflection on the sacred wound also came to mind. The wound becomes sacred when we are willing to let go of our old stories and become the vehicles through which the new story may emerge. The question also seemed to speak directly to Thomas Berry's observation that we are in between stories. The old ones no longer serve, and the new ones are being birthed. I just want to underscore the power of art. In that moment of great despair, I remembered a line, plant a tree, from a poem that gave rise to a vision of communal healing. Artists clearly have a critical consciousness shifting role to play as it relates to social change.
I'm from LA, and we're always talking about the carbon footprint. Carbon was at 350 parts per million when we were in Ghana in 2007. 7 years later, it's now up to 390, still rising. I don't care whose side you're on, where you stand on this emerging new environmental reality. Where you are in the world, if you're rich, white, black, African, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, it makes no difference. If that carbon keeps going up, nobody's going to be able to live on this planet. Well, that puts us all in the same boat, and our boat's sinking. When the boat's sinking, what does the captain yell out? Is it abandon ship? Well, it depends on the captain. And sometimes it's the captain who abandons the ship. Well, the captain's supposed to shout, all hands on deck. Everybody has to come and contribute to the well-being of the ship when it's sinking. And this is the time that we live in right now. A time when all hands have to be on deck. Technology has a role in it, but this is about the soul. This is about new relationships.
According to one of my friends and teachers, Angelus Arian, it's often the questions that we hold that most impact our inner landscape in a way that profoundly shifts our outer world. That's what happened with Dedan's question. What would healing look like? In that moment, I didn't want to hear it, but a powerful seed was planted. It was a question I couldn't walk away from. It was a question about the future, our collective future, a sustainable and thriving future for my daughter and my grandson. It was a question that asked, can we love all of you young people enough? Can we love you enough to ensure your future and your survival? I knew I couldn't come out of that slave dungeon and stand before you with only rage, with only anger and despair, and desire to never see another white person. Rage and despair are natural responses. But then what? What was the larger, emerging, new story? I had to get to hope. The first tree plantings. After marrying in Ghana, we went to Senegal for 3 weeks. While there, we engaged in a tree planting project with a group of Senegalese women who had a tree planting collective. We shared our vision, and there was a great deal of synergy. We spent a lot of time with Kumba Touré, a brilliant young Senegalese woman who, at the time, was the West Africa director of Ashoka, an organization engaging in social entrepreneurship around the world. Kumba is now the coordinator of Africans Rising. 2 years after our time with her in Senegal, Kumba ended up in the U.S. and having a baby without family support. Since we'd been incorporated into her family when we were in Senegal, we flew to Tennessee to be with her for the birth. She gave birth at the Farm Midwifery Center in Summertown, which trains people from all over the world to be midwives. As it turns out, Summertown is in Pulaski County, the very county that gave birth to the Ku Klux Klan in 1865. When we found this out, we thought, what better place to plant trees? So our first tree planting was in the heart of the Confederacy, in the home of the Klan, at a global birthing center that attracted women from all over the world. There were times when we were blown away by the synchronicity. We have a picture with African, African-American, and Euro-American hands joined together in a tree planting ceremony. Immediately, a question came up for us. We had envisioned that we would be planting trees along the Underground Railroad to honor all of the enslaved people who had died in their quest for freedom. And here we were, in the heart of the Confederacy and the home of the Klan. One morning, I realized there was this persistent and nagging question. What about the Confederate soldier? The question, which was disturbingly heartfelt, seemed to come out of nowhere. And to be honest, I wasn't happy about the question and its nagging persistence. I remember mentally talking back. If the Confederacy had won, we'd still be enslaved. How can we plant trees for them? But an inner voice challenged me. We're not talking about them. This is about you. If you are who you say you are trying to become, then what about the Confederate soldier? We ended up including the Confederate soldier in our vision of tree planting.
This is what I wrote for the ceremony that day. We invoke the spirit of our ancestors as we celebrate this firstborn child, Takuma, by planting an endangered tree, the longleaf pine. This is an endangered plant that once covered the entire South, but is now found only in the southeastern United States, and it's almost extinct. It's the most carbon-sequestering tree in the United States. We praised the baby's arrival by singing out his name, and we gave thanks to the many ancestors who had contributed their lives, their dreams, and their hopes to make the miracle of this new birth possible. Our small circle consisted of Africans, the mother and the baby, African Americans and Euro Americans circling up together as we gently patted the last handful of dirt around the base of that longleaf pine sapling. Our collective wish was that this rich black soil would bring life-giving nutrients to our young tree as our prayers had nurtured a new birth. We also were keenly aware that this fertile soil was enriched by the blood and the bone and the sweat and tears of so many. The Choctaw and the Cherokee, they're here. The remains of the enslaved and the enslavers are here. The soil is drenched with the blood and tears of both Confederate and Union soldiers. The haters and the hated, they're all here, intermingled in this fertile womb of life-giving earth. And I remember thinking, what an irony this is. All the horrible things we do to each other. And when we pass over to the other side, our physical bodies, our uniforms, our flags, all symbols of separation, compost back into this soil and give life to the living. Now, what kind of lesson is in that? All these lives, in countless and unrecognized ways, have been sacrificed to the mystery of this rich Tennessee soil. Although separated in life, they were now united in giving new life and sustenance to our little tree. In the words of Shehis, a late 19th century Reno Crow shaman, the soil you see is not ordinary soil. It is the dust of the blood, the flesh, and the bones of our ancestors. You will have to dig down through the surface before you can find nature's earth, as the upper portion is Crow. The land, as it is, my blood and my dead, it is consecrated.
We were deeply honored also to have been invited to Selma, Alabama, to plant trees at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, to help commemorate the anniversary of the historic march from Selma to Montgomery, where civil rights workers were beaten bloody and not allowed to proceed. That was March 7, 1965. The day would go down in history as Bloody Sunday. The image of state police violence against peaceful marchers outraged the world and galvanized the movement and the nation, forcing Congress to eventually pass the historic Voting Rights Act. The footage and the story are relived in the PBS documentary Eyes on the Prize. We did a ceremonial tree planting at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, at the place where Bloody Sunday had taken place decades earlier. We were joined by a cross-section of people, civil rights legends, activists, and representatives from organizations from around the world, including Congressman John Lewis, Dick Gregory, Janet and Bob Moses, Drew Dillinger, Reverend Sekou, Carlene Griffin, and a daughter of Viola Luiso. This tree planting along the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights Trail was co-sponsored by the National Voting Rights Museum, the Alabama Forestry Commission, the U.S. Forestry Service, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. People from around the country and the world came to help plant our little trees of healing and remembrance in a place that had caused so much pain and suffering. Many young people joined in the ceremony. Some of them came from Oakland, California, where we were engaged in intergenerational tree planting ceremonies focused on combating urban violence.
The young people we've had the privilege of working with and learning from are very talented. Often they spontaneously create music and song for the occasion. We've done ceremonial plantings in a number of different places, including Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and the Deep South, and along the Underground Railroad in Canada. And one of the last cabins to welcome and conceal hundreds of people escaping slavery in the United States. The plantings have provided an opportunity to meet and collaborate and be surprised by the profound shifts in consciousness that we encountered. We did a tree planting ceremony with someone we viewed as a classic Southern belle, but at the end of the ceremony I conducted, she said in this very familiar drawl, "I'm tired of this Southern white life and how it disrespects certain people. Y'all need to come down here, plant more trees. We've got to heal this stuff."
The tree planting ceremony she participated in was in Colquitt, Georgia, and occurred during the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, 1861, 1865. All across the South, the 150th anniversary commemoration took the form of reenacting various Civil War battles with hundreds of men in gray and blue uniforms running around, shooting, quote unquote, each other. We were deeply honored to provide a different healing and ceremonial experience around such a painful, devastating, and unhealed national wound.
We were also invited to Canada to spend some time in ceremony with Diane Longboat and our Mohawk friends. I was extremely ill at that time. I was in the midst of cancer treatment, and we'd been invited to attend a spiritual ceremony in their lodge, a ceremony they had been holding on my behalf since hearing of my cancer diagnosis 6 months earlier. As Belvie said, we planted a tree at one of the last standing cabins along that Canadian portion of the Underground Railroad. While in Canada, I took a handful of soil with me because there had been a man enslaved there. His name was Richard Pierpont. His last wish was to be sent home, and he was not allowed to return home to Africa, even though he was a free man. While in Canada, we spent time with an African who was returning home to Africa, so I sent that soil back to Africa, so at least some particles of Richard Pierpont could go where he wanted to be.
These stories and others illustrated for us the power and presence of the soil and the wisdom of the trees. How could we plant trees, of all things, along the Underground Railroad for just one group of people? Since trees breathe for everyone. The logic of the very symbol of healing that we had chosen to plant dictated that we include the enslaved and the enslavers, as well as Confederate and Union soldiers. As Dedan pointed out in his ceremonial offering, the soil receives us all. The soil and the seeds became a much-needed metaphor for hope and possibility.
And a metaphor for community. The people who come to join our ceremonies come together from all different backgrounds to work hard, side by side, digging holes in the ground, getting dirty. By the time we're ready for the tree planting, it's like a love fest. That's what healing looks like and feels like.
In response to the question, what healing looks like? You're what healing looks like. This is what healing looks like. I know there's a lot in the culture about what's not working. But what's really important, and why we like to share a little about what we do, is to focus on what is working. We often get caught up, particularly those of us who are older activists, on the struggle and the problem. We came of age in the civil rights movement, so it was a struggle. When we were in the Deep South as young people, we had to sit in the back of the bus. We could only drink from the colored public fountain. So struggle is really important. And focusing on the problems is important. But equally important is focusing on the solutions. In spaces like this, that's what you get to do. So we're very hopeful. We come here because of your energy. However strong our energy is, we won't be here forever. But we can see the future through you. And so we thank you. Closing. Shortly after our presentation at the University of Redlands, Dedan's cancer was found to have spread, and he entered Zen Hospice of San Francisco. He said he was in a dance, not a fight, with life. Dedan had been a shot caller on the streets of Los Angeles for most of his life. And he was a shot caller to the end. His hospice instructions to me: I know, my love, that there will be tears and sadness and heartache. But try also to remember the journey, the beauty, the laughter, and most important, the love. And especially during the hard times, try to remember all the seeds we have planted. Seeds that will need nurturing now more than ever. Just know that I will be there. On the eve of winter solstice, December 20th, 2015, Dedan, surrounded by me and his 3 wonderful sons, Trinell, Dedan Jr., and Manza, took his last breath. Glancing beyond us with a wide-eyed look of awe and wonder at whatever or whomever he was seeing in the distance, he smiled and took his very last breath. Later, we all agreed that his ecstatic, smiling departure was his final gift to to us. We end this chapter with one of Dedan's poems, published in our book, I Give You the Springtime of My Blushing Heart, a poetic love song.
Child of the Middle Passage. I am a descendant of the Middle Passage. My lips are African. My last name is European, not African. I am a stunning mix of human diversity. In my centuries of suffering, I embody the whole. I am the ultimate global being. Despite the tragedy that marred my journey, I have arrived at this moment of clarity, whether from passion, or kidnap, or rape, or love. When the sperm embraced the egg, new life was ignited. Beauty blossomed in the face of the newborn innocence reaching out to love and be loved.